The year was 1943. The war in Europe had raged for 4 long years. In North Africa, the German Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had fought hard but could not stop the Allied advance. As the German lines collapsed, thousands of German soldiers were captured. These prisoners were transported across the Atlantic to the United States. The journey was long and uncertain. Many of the men expected harsh treatment. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that Americans were cruel, that captivity meant hunger and misery. Instead, they found something very different when they arrived on American soil. One of the largest prisoner of war camps was Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Another was Camp Swift, Texas. These camps were remote, far from the front lines, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by American soldiers. Trains brought the captured Germans deep into the American heartland. They stepped down from the rail cars exhausted, dirty, and wary. The first surprise came quickly. As they were processed, each prisoner was handed a ration pack. This was the same standard issue given to American soldiers. Inside were items the Germans could hardly believe: chocolate bars, chewing gum, real coffee, even cigarettes. For many of the prisoners, it was the first time in months they had seen such things. Germany, under heavy Allied bombing, struggled to supply its own troops. Back home, families lived on limited rations. German soldiers in the field often survived on thin soup, bread, potatoes, and sometimes canned meat if they were lucky. Coffee was a luxury long gone. Most of the time, they drank a bitter substitute made from roasted barley or acorns. The U.S. Army ration was something else entirely. The breakfast unit often included canned ham and eggs, biscuits, sugar, and powdered coffee. The lunch pack had cheese, meat, or peanut butter, along with candy or a chocolate bar. Dinner might include canned beef and a powdered drink mix. Even gum was standard. Cigarettes were almost always included. The total calories were carefully calculated to keep a soldier strong in combat. The logistics behind these rations were immense. America's vast farms and factories worked around the clock. The U.S. had a supply chain unmatched by any other nation in the war. This abundance allowed the Army not only to feed its own forces overseas but also to provide for enemy prisoners. At first, the Germans were suspicious. Some thought the rations were a trick, that perhaps the food was laced with something. Others were simply stunned. One soldier unwrapped a stick of gum and stared at it, unsure what to do. An American guard laughed and showed him how to chew it. Another prisoner poured his first cup of real coffee in months. He took a slow sip and shook his head in disbelief. The reactions varied. A few men were openly grateful. Others hid their feelings, not wanting to show weakness. One German officer was heard muttering, "If this is how they feed their prisoners, how do they feed their own troops?" That single comment spread through the camp like wildfire. American guards watched all this unfold. Many of them were farm boys and factory workers themselves. They treated the prisoners firmly but fairly. By following the rules of the Geneva Convention, the U.S. hoped to encourage German soldiers in the field to surrender rather than fight to the last man. Healthy prisoners could also be put to work on local farms or in war-related industries, freeing American manpower for the front lines. The daily routine of camp life quickly developed. Prisoners lined up at meal times, received their rations, and sat together in mess halls. The food was predictable but plentiful. Over time, the Germans began to realize that this treatment was consistent. There was no hidden cruelty. They were being fed better than many of their families back in Germany. Some of the prisoners kept diaries. In one entry, a young conscript described his amazement at the abundance of food. He wrote about saving a piece of chocolate to send home after the war as proof that such things had existed. Others sketched drawings of the ration boxes or the camp layout. The contrast with their own army's rations gnawed at them. German soldiers at the front often received hard black bread and watery soup, sometimes accompanied by a small ration of horse meat or tinned fish. Supplies grew worse as the war dragged on. Meanwhile, American troops had access to balanced meals, vitamins, and even small comforts like candy. Word of this disparity began to reach German units still in combat. Through letters and through the accounts of captured soldiers who were later exchanged, the story spread. Surrender to the Americans and you would be treated well. This had a subtle effect on morale. For the men inside the camp, the food became more than just sustenance. It was a symbol of a different world. One German prisoner later recalled how the first taste of real coffee felt like waking from a long nightmare. Another said the simple act of chewing gum gave him hope that life could return to normal someday. There were strict rules, of course. Guards enforced discipline, and escapes were punished. But within those fences, small acts of understanding took place. An American guard might slip an extra cigarette to a prisoner who worked hard in the fields. A German prisoner might teach a few words of his language to a curious guard. These small exchanges built a fragile bridge between enemies. As the seasons passed, the initial shock faded, but the memory of that first meal remained vivid for many of the men. It challenged everything they had been told about their enemy. It also revealed the vast industrial and agricultural strength behind the American war effort. In those quiet camps far from the battlefront, a simple box of rations told a powerful story. It spoke of a nation's ability to fight a global war and still extend a measure of dignity to those it had defeated. The U.S. Army designed its field rations to keep soldiers strong and ready for battle. Each ration had 3 parts: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The K-ration was small and easy to carry, packed in a simple cardboard box that fit inside a soldier's pack. It was made to be opened quickly and eaten anywhere, whether in a muddy foxhole, a tent, or a moving truck. The breakfast unit usually held canned ham and eggs, a packet of biscuits, sugar, and a small tin of instant coffee. There was also a stick of chewing gum. These items gave a soldier protein and energy to start the day. Lunch was lighter but still filling. It often included canned cheese or processed meat, a chocolate bar, and several cigarettes. Dinner came with canned beef, a powdered drink mix that turned into lemonade or orange drink when water was added, and a piece of candy. The total calories in one full K-ration were about 2,800 to 3,000, enough to fuel a man through a full day of marching and fighting. The packaging was practical. Each item was sealed to stay fresh for months. Soldiers could tear open the wax paper or cardboard without needing tools. This was important in combat where time and safety mattered. Even small details were considered. Gum was included not only as a treat but also to help clean teeth when brushing was not possible. Cigarettes were standard, as smoking was common and seen as a way to calm nerves in stressful situations. The ingredients reflected the power of the American food industry. The U.S. had massive farms producing wheat, corn, beef, pork, sugar, and dairy. Canning factories worked day and night to supply the military. Coffee came from imports managed through secure shipping routes. Sugar refineries in Louisiana and the Midwest churned out tons of product for both the civilian population and the armed forces. The sheer scale of this production meant that even a prisoner of war could receive the same basic food as an American soldier. In contrast, German rations were far simpler and often inadequate by mid-war. A typical German soldier received black bread made from rye, thin soups made from cabbage or turnips, and boiled potatoes. Meat was rare and usually came in small portions like a few slices of sausage or a small piece of horse meat. Occasionally, there was canned fish or tinned beef, but these were not regular issues. German coffee had been a memory since early in the war. Instead, soldiers drank a bitter substitute made from roasted barley, acorns, or chicory. It was dark in color but lacked the caffeine and taste of real coffee. Sugar was scarce, and sweets were considered luxuries. Most soldiers went months without seeing chocolate or candy. The calorie difference was stark. German rations often fell below 2,000 calories a day, especially in the later years of the war. Soldiers on the Eastern Front sometimes lived on even less, leading to fatigue, illness, and a decline in combat effectiveness. In winter, when more calories were needed to stay warm, shortages were even more severe. The U.S. system was built on planning and logistics. Food moved from farms to railcars, from railcars to ships, and from ships to forward bases around the world. Every step was coordinated by the Quartermaster Corps. Their job was to make sure no unit went hungry. Even when fighting stretched across oceans, supply lines remained steady. This efficiency gave American troops a steady flow of high-quality food and supplies. The same system applied to prisoner of war camps inside the U.S. When captured German soldiers arrived, the army already had a plan to feed them. They were issued the same rations as American soldiers, following the Geneva Convention rules. For many prisoners, the first meal in an American camp was a shock. They were handed boxes filled with items they had not seen since before the war. The difference between the two armies' food supplies reflected larger truths about the war. The United States had not been bombed. Its farms and factories were safe, and its transportation network remained intact. Germany, on the other hand, faced heavy Allied bombing that destroyed railroads, factories, and warehouses. Fuel shortages slowed the movement of trains and trucks. As the war dragged on, feeding the civilian population became harder, let alone feeding millions of soldiers scattered across multiple fronts. Inside the camps, the process of issuing rations was orderly. Prisoners lined up, received their packs, and sat down to eat. The first thing many noticed was the variety. There were different flavors, different textures, and even small comforts like sugar cubes and chewing gum. Some POWs saved these treats to trade with other prisoners or to keep for special occasions. Others ate them quickly, unable to resist after months of deprivation. The reaction among German officers was often private but telling. Some were embarrassed that their army, which prided itself on discipline and organization, could not provide the same level of care for its own men. Rumors spread quickly through the barracks. If the Americans could afford to feed their enemies like this, what resources did they have for their own soldiers? On screen, a table might show the comparison clearly. Under the U.S. column, ham and eggs, canned beef, biscuits, coffee, chocolate, gum, cigarettes, candy. Under the German column, black bread, cabbage soup, boiled potatoes, barley coffee, occasional sausage or fish. The numbers tell the story just as well as the images. Calories per day, variety of nutrients, and reliability of supply all favored the U.S. by a wide margin. This difference in diet had direct effects on health and morale. American soldiers stayed strong, recovered faster from wounds, and maintained energy during long campaigns. German soldiers, weakened by poor rations, became more vulnerable to illness and exhaustion. For the prisoners, the sudden improvement in food quality often led to weight gain and a visible return of health within weeks. Behind each ration box was a vast network of farmers, factory workers, railroad crews, and planners. Their combined effort gave the U.S. military a quiet but decisive edge. Even in captivity, the food handed to a German prisoner carried a message. This was a nation with resources to fight a global war and still show humanity to its captives. The train screeched to a halt under a gray winter sky. The German prisoners shifted in their seats, stiff from the long ride. Outside, the cold air cut through their thin uniforms as American guards shouted orders. The men filed out of the boxcars, blinking in the pale light. They expected to see punishment camps, bare ground, and rows of angry guards with rifles ready. Instead, they saw neat rows of wooden barracks and tall fences topped with barbed wire. The camp looked orderly and strangely clean. Some of the prisoners exchanged quick glances but said nothing. Their boots crunched on the frozen gravel as they were led to a processing area. American soldiers stood behind tables stacked with small cardboard boxes. The prisoners were lined up and handed one box each. The guards were brisk but not rough. No one yelled insults. No one struck the prisoners. It was confusing. The first German in line stared at the box in his hands. He expected something meager, maybe a crust of bread or a ladle of thin soup. Instead, he saw printed labels in English. Inside the box were tins and packets, each neatly wrapped. He recognized some of the words even without translation. Coffee, sugar, biscuits. One soldier opened the tin of ham and eggs and froze. The smell hit him like a wave. It was rich and warm, the scent of real food, not the watery turnip soup he had been living on for months. He held it close, almost afraid it would be taken away. Another prisoner pulled out a small, shiny object. It was a stick of chewing gum. He turned it over in his hand, unsure what it was. The American guard across the table smirked and chewed an imaginary piece to show him. The prisoner mimicked the motion and finally put it in his mouth. His eyes widened as he tasted mint for the first time in years. At the end of the line, a German officer opened his rations slowly. He examined each item carefully. Canned beef, chocolate bar, packets of sugar, even cigarettes. He looked up at his men, then back down at the food. In a low voice, he said, "If this is how they feed prisoners, how do they feed their own soldiers?" The words traveled down the line. Men repeated them quietly, as if testing their weight. A murmur of disbelief spread through the group. These soldiers had been raised on Nazi propaganda. They were told the Americans were soft, weak, and decadent. They believed their own army was the strongest, the best supplied, the most disciplined. Now, standing in this camp, holding candy and coffee, those beliefs began to crack. Some prisoners looked angry. Others seemed lost. A few laughed bitterly, shaking their heads. They remembered the bread rations back home, dark loaves stretched with sawdust to make them last. They thought of the acorn coffee substitute their families drank. Here, in a land untouched by bombing, even the enemy's prisoners were given luxuries that German civilians had not seen in years. The American guards watched closely. Most stayed silent, but a few couldn't hide their amusement. They had grown up with these foods. To them, gum and chocolate were everyday items, nothing special. Seeing the Germans treat them like treasure was strange. One guard leaned toward another and muttered, "Hell, they probably think this is a feast." The other guard just nodded. As the prisoners sat down to eat, the tension deepened. The German officer ate slowly, keeping his face blank. Around him, his men tore into the food. Some closed their eyes as they chewed, savoring each bite. Others ate mechanically, silent and grim. The air filled with the smell of canned meat and hot coffee. Steam rose from tin cups. It was almost too much for some of the prisoners. A young soldier stared at his meal and whispered that it felt like a dream. In the guard tower, an American corporal watched through binoculars. He had fought in North Africa and seen these same men surrender. Back then, they were confident, their uniforms sharp, their boots polished. Now they were thin, dirty, and hollow-eyed. He saw them eating and wondered what was going through their minds. For the Germans, the moment carried more weight than anyone expected. It wasn't just about hunger. It was about pride. They had been told they were the master race, destined to rule. Yet here they were, prisoners in a strange land, being fed better than their own families back home. As night fell, conversations began in the barracks. Some prisoners questioned everything they had been taught. If the Americans had this much food for prisoners, what did that mean for the war? Could Germany really win against a country with such resources? Others refused to believe it, insisting this was a trick meant to weaken their resolve. Arguments broke out. A sergeant shouted that they must stay loyal, that the fatherland needed them. Another soldier snapped back, pointing to his half-eaten chocolate bar. "Loyalty doesn't fill your stomach," he said. The room went quiet. In the morning, the routine continued. More boxes were handed out, more steaming cups of coffee poured. The initial shock faded slightly, but the questions lingered. Every meal was a reminder of what they had seen and tasted. The American guards kept their distance, but they noticed changes. The prisoners were quieter now, more thoughtful. There were fewer attempts to escape, fewer acts of defiance. The simple act of giving food had done what speeches and threats could not. In those early days of captivity, a small box of rations became a weapon of its own kind. It worked slowly, breaking down old beliefs and planting seeds of doubt. By the time the war ended, many of these men would remember not just the battles they fought, but the first time they held a stick of gum and realized the world was not what they had been told. Snow drifted against the fence line as night settled over the camp. Inside the barracks, a young German conscript sat on a rough wooden bunk with a stub of pencil and a small notebook. The light above him flickered, casting uneven shadows across the room. He wrote carefully, pressing hard into the paper so the words would last. He recorded the day's events with the precision of someone trying to make sense of a strange new world. He described the guards who treated them firmly but without cruelty, the meals that were far richer than anything he had expected, and the faces of his fellow prisoners as they tasted chocolate for the first time in months. In one entry, He wrote that the hardest thing to understand was the kindness. He had been told the Americans were savages who would beat them, starve them, maybe even kill them. Instead, he found himself holding a steaming cup of coffee given freely by a guard who said nothing more than, "Drink up, it's cold out." Across the barracks, another prisoner held a small piece of candy wrapped in bright foil. He had been saving it for weeks, tucked inside the lining of his coat. He didn't eat it. Instead, he planned to keep it until the war ended. When he returned home, he would give it to his younger sister. It would be proof that such things still existed, proof that there were places in the world where food was plentiful and life was not ruled by ration cards and fear. The candy became more than sugar. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder of a world beyond the bombed-out cities of Germany. Each night, he checked to make sure it was still safe, still whole, and then closed his eyes, thinking of his family and the day he might walk through his front door carrying a gift for his sister. Not every prisoner felt gratitude. Some were suspicious, certain that the food and fair treatment were tricks meant to weaken their loyalty. Others felt deep shame. In later years, many men admitted they were torn between relief and humiliation. Relief that they were safe and well-fed, shame that their enemy was showing them a level of care their own army had not. One former POW recalled in an interview decades later how difficult those feelings were. He remembered eating his first American meal and realizing that his captors had access to resources beyond anything he had imagined. "It was like stepping into another world," he said. "You felt grateful, but at the same time you felt small. We were the ones who had invaded their allies' lands, and yet here they were, giving us coffee and bread." The American guards experienced their own changes. At first, they saw the prisoners only as enemies. Many of the guards had fought in North Africa or had lost friends in the war. They arrived at the camps expecting to hate the men behind the barbed wire. But as the days passed, the lines between enemy and fellow human began to blur. One guard, a farmer's son from Iowa, noticed that the Germans working in the camp fields were skilled and careful. When a prisoner fixed a broken fence using a trick from his own farm back home, the guard laughed and said, "Guess some things don't change, no matter what side you're on." After that, he started slipping the man an extra biscuit when he could. It was a small act, but in the cold world of war, it meant something. Coffee became a quiet bridge between captors and captives. In the early mornings, when frost coated the ground and breath turned white in the air, guards sometimes shared their tin cups with the men they watched over. The conversations were short, often no more than a few words and a nod, but those moments carried weight. A diary found years later contained a single sentence about such an exchange. "Today, an American gave me half his coffee. For a moment, there was no war." Small acts like these broke down the stereotypes both sides carried. The Germans had been taught that Americans were decadent and weak, obsessed with money and comfort. The Americans had been told that Germans were heartless and cruel, machines of war without compassion. A simple cup of coffee, passed from one hand to another, told a different story. As the months went on, the camp developed its own rhythm. The Germans worked in nearby fields or factories, guarded but not mistreated. The food remained steady, arriving in trains and trucks that ran like clockwork. Some prisoners gained weight and color in their cheeks, the visible proof of regular meals. At night, stories were shared quietly in the barracks. Some men spoke of home, of wives and children, of cities now reduced to rubble. Others talked about their first days in the camp and the shock they felt when given American rations. A few even admitted they looked forward to breakfast, especially the biscuits and coffee. One evening, a guard heard laughter coming from a barracks window. He stopped to listen and realized the men inside were joking in broken English, trying to mimic American accents. For a brief moment, it sounded like any group of young men teasing one another. He smiled and walked on, thinking how strange it was that war had brought them all to this place. There were still fences and rules, still escapes and punishments. The war had not ended, and no one forgot which side they were on. But within the boundaries of the camp, small gestures of understanding grew. A shared smoke, a lesson in how to chew gum, a story told across a language barrier with gestures and laughter. Years later, Many former prisoners spoke about those small moments more than the battles they fought. They remembered the day an American handed them food without malice, the day a guard offered a sip of coffee on a freezing morning, the day they realized that even in war, an enemy could show mercy. These memories stayed with them long after the guns fell silent, reminders of a time when simple human kindness cut through the barbed wire and suspicion. The decision to feed German prisoners well was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice made by the U.S. Army and the government in Washington. At first glance, it looked like simple compassion. In reality, it was a strategy shaped by law, planning, and the demands of a global war. The United States was bound by the Geneva Conventions, which set strict rules for the treatment of prisoners. These rules required adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Violating them would have opened the door for Germany to mistreat captured American soldiers. By following the rules, the U.S. protected its own troops. It also gave American leaders the moral high ground. The government could point to the camps and say, "We uphold international law, even when our enemies do not." But there was more to it than legality. The Army understood that how prisoners were treated could influence the fighting on the battlefield. A soldier who believed he would be executed or starved if captured would fight to the last bullet. A soldier who heard that surrender meant a full stomach and humane treatment might lay down his weapon sooner. Feeding prisoners well was a message to every German soldier still in the field. Capture does not mean death. It means survival. This idea was not abstract. Reports of conditions inside American camps spread quickly. Prisoners wrote letters home, describing the food and the fair treatment. Even with wartime censorship, these letters carried enough detail to reach German families and, eventually, German soldiers at the front. Word of mouth traveled faster than any official propaganda. By 1944, entire German units facing the Americans began to surrender more readily than those fighting the Soviets or even the British. For the U.S., the policy paid off in practical ways. Prisoners who were well-fed and healthy could work. The war had drained the American labor force. Millions of young men were overseas fighting, leaving farms and factories short of hands. The Army allowed German POWs to work under guard in agriculture and industry. In the Midwest and the South, prisoners picked cotton, harvested wheat, and canned vegetables. In some regions, they repaired roads or cut timber. This labor kept food production steady and freed American civilians to focus on other war jobs. If the prisoners had been starved or mistreated, they would have been too weak or sick to contribute. Feeding them well was a simple equation. Calories in, work out. The system was carefully managed. Farmers paid a small wage to the government, which covered the costs of transport and security. The prisoners themselves received a token amount credited to their accounts, which they could use to buy small items like extra soap or writing paper. The arrangement benefited everyone. American farms stayed productive, and the prisoners gained a sense of purpose instead of sitting idle behind barbed wire. The psychological effect on the German army was even more significant. As news spread of good treatment, the contrast with Nazi propaganda grew sharper. The German government had spent years portraying the Allies as cruel and barbaric. They claimed that capture by the Americans would mean torture or death. Every German prisoner who returned home alive and well challenged that lie. Some German soldiers began to question what they had been told about the war. If their enemies were treating them decently, what else had been false? These doubts eroded morale. A soldier with doubts fights less fiercely. A unit with doubts is more likely to collapse under pressure. The effect was most visible late in the war. In the summer of 1944, after the Normandy landings, American forces advanced through France and into Germany. They captured tens of thousands of German troops. In many cases, surrender happened without a fight. Soldiers who had heard from friends or family about the camps in America chose to give up rather than die defending hopeless positions. Feeding prisoners well also had a propaganda value beyond the battlefield. The U.S. used it to show the world the difference between democracy and fascism. Photographs of well-fed German prisoners appeared in newspapers. Reports were sent to neutral nations like Switzerland and Sweden. These images countered German claims and reassured Allied citizens that their cause was just. The policy contrasted sharply with what Germany was doing. German camps for captured Americans and British soldiers were often harsh and undersupplied. The treatment of Soviet prisoners was even worse, with mass starvation and death. By comparison, the American camps looked almost humane. This difference strengthened America's position in diplomatic negotiations and gave it leverage when dealing with other nations. The decision to follow the Geneva Conventions also shaped the behavior of individual guards and officers. They knew that mistreating prisoners was not only immoral but also strategically foolish. Every prisoner they fed and sheltered became a living message to the enemy. Discipline in the camps was strict, but it was also controlled. The guards were trained to maintain order without cruelty. Some officers understood that food itself was a weapon. A steady diet of rations, served without anger, could change how a prisoner saw his captors, could turn fear into grudging respect. In some cases, it even fostered cooperation. Prisoners who trusted their captors were less likely to plot escapes or sabotage. As the war continued, the numbers grew. By 1945, there were more than 400,000 German prisoners in the United States. Feeding and housing them required a massive effort, but it was a fraction of the overall war budget. The return was enormous. Healthy prisoners provided labor, weakened the enemy's resolve, and proved to the world that the U.S. fought by rules that others could not match. The strategy was subtle, but its impact was visible on both sides of the Atlantic. In the fields of Kansas and Texas, German prisoners worked alongside American civilians, planting and harvesting crops. In the forests of Maine, they cut timber that would build ships and crates. At the same time, on the battlefields of Europe, German soldiers whispered to one another about the food and safety that awaited if they surrendered to the Americans. A simple meal, repeated day after day, became part of the machinery of victory. It was not just about keeping prisoners alive. It was about shaping the choices of men still fighting, influencing decisions made far from the quiet camps of the American heartland. The war ended, and the fences around the camps came down. German prisoners, once guarded day and night, were loaded onto trains and ships for the long journey home. They carried few possessions, only what they could fit in a small pack or pocket. Many carried memories that weighed far more than any physical thing. The journey back to Germany was quiet. The men looked out at the American countryside one last time. They passed endless fields of wheat, rows of factories still humming, towns untouched by bombing. For years they had eaten food grown in those fields and packed in those factories. The sight of such abundance stayed with them. It was a picture of what a nation could do when it was not torn apart by war. When they arrived in Germany, they found a different world. Cities were piles of rubble. Rail lines were twisted metal. Families stood in long lines for bread that never seemed to be enough. The contrast was staggering. Men who had eaten 3 solid meals a day as prisoners now faced hunger as free men. Some tried to describe their experiences to relatives and neighbors, but many people did not believe them. They spoke of American camps where prisoners were treated with fairness, where chocolate and coffee were given freely, where guards shared cigarettes without anger. To people living among ruins and ashes, these stories sounded impossible. In time, more returning prisoners confirmed the accounts. As their stories spread, they began to shape how West Germans viewed their former enemies. These men had lived among Americans. They had seen another way of life. For some, the experience planted a seed. They saw that democracy was not weakness. They understood that a government could be strong without ruling by fear. Years later, when West Germany rebuilt itself as a democratic nation, many former POWs played roles in that transformation. Some became local officials, teachers, or leaders in civic groups. They brought with them lessons learned not on the battlefield but inside the quiet boundaries of American camps. They remembered how a system built on rules and discipline could still allow for dignity and respect. One former prisoner recalled sitting at a camp table, drinking real coffee for the first time in years. He remembered thinking that no German officer had ever treated him with such simple fairness. That moment stayed with him long after the war. When he later became a mayor in his hometown, he said he tried to govern with that same sense of fairness he had witnessed as a prisoner. The cultural impact was lasting as well. German men who had been young soldiers returned home with a taste for things they had never known before. Baseball games played by American guards, country music on camp radios. the sweet taste of peanut butter. These small encounters left marks. After the war, as West Germany rebuilt and American forces stayed as allies, these shared experiences helped create a bridge between former enemies. American abundance was not just about food. It was about a way of life. The POWs had seen stores full of goods, towns with working lights, trains that ran on time. They had witnessed a society where citizens did not fear the knock on the door at night. For men raised under a dictatorship, this was powerful. It gave them a model to imagine as they rebuilt their own communities. The treatment of prisoners also had a wider effect on the rules of war. The contrast between how the Allies treated prisoners and how the Axis powers treated theirs was stark. German camps for Soviet prisoners were scenes of mass death. Allied prisoners in German hands often suffered from neglect and hunger. By comparison, American camps looked almost humane. When diplomats gathered to revise international laws after the war, these differences mattered. The Geneva Conventions were strengthened, with clearer standards for food, medical care, and work programs for prisoners. The idea was simple. No nation should again face the choice between cruelty and survival. The U.S. example during World War II became a reference point for these new rules. In later conflicts, these laws shaped how armies behaved. They did not prevent all abuses, but they gave soldiers and governments a standard to aim for. The memory of World War II and the images of well-fed prisoners behind American fences served as a reminder that even in total war, there were lines that should not be crossed. Some former prisoners returned to the United States years later, not as captives but as visitors. They came to see the places where they had once been held. In towns near old campsites, they found locals who remembered working alongside them in the fields or factories. Handshakes replaced guarded stares. Photographs were taken where barbed wire once stood. One man carried a small piece of candy back with him to Germany. He had kept it hidden during his captivity, never eating it. He showed it to his grandchildren as proof of what he had experienced. To him, it was not just candy. It was a symbol of survival and of the strange kindness he had encountered far from home. These personal stories passed down through families kept the memory alive. They became part of the larger history of how two nations that had been enemies learned to live side by side. In West Germany, admiration for certain aspects of American culture grew. The music, the films, even the food became familiar in a way they never would have without the experience of captivity. Even today, the stories of those camps are told in museums and books. Visitors can see the wooden bunks, the ration boxes, and the letters home written in careful script. These simple artifacts speak of a time when a soldier's fate depended not only on battles but on the choices made by those who captured him. The legacy of those choices is not measured only in treaties or political alliances. It is measured in the lives of men who went to war, were defeated, and yet returned home with a broader view of the world. It is found in the memories of shared meals, in the quiet moments when an enemy guard poured coffee for a prisoner, and in the understanding that even during war, humanity can endure.